Joan's start of his new life in the city. After Joan had got into the car, his eyes did not leave the present people who came to see him off even when the driver began driving. He could not change the direction of his sight to others, especially his sweetheart, Katie, who tried to be strong in front of him and did not show her weakness. But she could not and began crying. Joan glimpsed her and the car had moved a little far away. He changed direction of his sight and his eyes began pouring out tears. It was a fateful trip whose first steps must be taken by him. His life tape began to pass in front of him in a tremendous speed in the fields. His mother, his father, Katie, the school and all memories. Oh my God! It is the first time for him to leave all that suddenly. Joan put his hand on his head and looked below the car. And he tried to forget or be made to forget all these agitated feelings for a long time till the driver's call to him ceased them. "Joan, Joan, my son Joan." When Joan turned to him and said, "Yes," he said, "Do not grieve much as these feelings are very natural and indicate your kindorigin. You are a noble young man and many of the people whom I give a lift, and are in the same circumstances of yours, are happy to leave whom they love. You are a man deserving their love. I advise you not to dishearten them of what you are going to achieve." Joan replied to him saying, "I will not dishearten them. I will do my best to achieve my dream and theirs." After nearly 4 hours, the old man replied to him saying, "Well, stop. There is a restaurant on the way that you will like much." Joan had already started moving away from the villages surrounding his village, which he had not actually visited before. But they had not actually entered any city as the cattle were still everywhere and the few scattered houses were prevailing over the place. They stopped at the restaurant and had their lunch. And then they continued the road that was already long. It continued for nearly 10 hours. Joan was really very tired, and was not used to staying for this period in a car till the car approached the city. Joan could not hide his astonishment about what he had seen. For him, the city was a strange place to be heard only in novels, or from his high school teacher. Mick, his eyes are wide apart and he looks at the people with amazement about everything: clothes, cars, children, and old houses. He even asked the driver about a house, and said, "Is this a government office?" So, he started laughing and replied, "My son, this is a house for a family, not a government office." This transformation in Joan's life did not come gradually, but it was a surprise to him. Everything he meets is considered almost the first time he sees in front of him. Until the driver arrived at the university and stood in front of it and said, "Here we are, Joan. This is the university." Joan looked at the university and was in awe of what he had seen: large buildings, large squares, corridors and great walls. He did not reply to him and effects of astonishment were on him. And the driver repeated again, "Oh, Joan, and here we are. Get out of the car." He got off and followed the driver for a while. And then he returned to Joan and said to him, "My son, where will you live? Do you have housing in the university or what?" He said, "I do not know." The driver was astonished and said to him, "Are you joking with me? You are in the city and the university is in 2 weeks' time. Will you stay here in the street till time of study comes?" Joan replied, "Actually, I do not know." Then the driver took him to a restaurant serving fast food and was near the location. They found an old woman called Meckel and asked her about an available room for rent. Meckel looked at them and asked whether it was for both of them or for either of them. The driver replied that it would be for Joan, who would start study in 2 weeks as he needed it only for that period. She welcomed them and showed them the room, which was small and had a bathroom only. Joan agreed at once as it was completely suitable for him. The driver said goodbye to Joan, saying, "Take care of yourself. Do not go away. This is a large city where you can be exposed to evil people. Wait for the university and go." Joan fell asleep that night as he was completely exhausted. In the morning, he went out and found Meckel had already started opening the restaurant and receiving customers. He sat in the restaurant, and she came to him and said, "Good morning, how was your first night here?" So he said it was wonderful. "I slept for a long time and as if I was the first time I did it in my life." When he said there was no room for much sleep at my village. She said, "Why?" He said that there were many things to be done and I would tell you about them later. She said, "What do you want for breakfast?" And he said, "Anything. I'm really very hungry." So she brought him eggs with juice. John spent 2 weeks going to Mrs. Meckel to eat and to spend time with her, because he was alone and waiting for the university. And it seems that the affection was already between them as they share loneliness. So it was a motivation for affection between them till he said to her, on the last days of the holiday, "Listen, Meckel, this will be the last night for me here. And the university will pay costs of my accommodation according to the agreement in their scholarship." Meckel felt sad and said to him, "Listen, I hope you accept my offer. I want you to complete your accommodation here. The university is very close to here, and your accommodation will be free of charge, provided you help me with some light work in the restaurant." In fact, Meckel lived a sad life, as she lost her husband a long time ago and became lonely throughout that period, and was dreaming of children. But she could not, and when she started taking care of Joan at breakfast time, and woke him up from his sleep in the morning, and took care of washing his clothes and other things, which she did for him, she felt a sense of motherhood and some satisfaction after all the years of sadness that she went through. Joan refused the offer, and said, "I cannot, because the scholarship is responsible for this matter. And I will be closer to the university with my colleagues. Life there is better for me than here. Listen, Mrs. Meckel, thank you for everything you have given me, but I really cannot. And if you do it in terms of charity for me, I am not so poor. Thank you, Mrs. Meckel, for everything." Mrs. Michelle started crying and said, "No, wait, I will explain to you." And she justified her position by dreaming of a child that cares for him. After leaving her husband and due to her loneliness for many years, Joan stopped talking to her for a while and said, "It is okay to stay here." And then Mrs. Meckel became more joyful due to John's decision. And she had already started dealing with John as her son. And with the passage of time, her interest in him began to make him forget the bitterness of the distance from his village, his family and his lover Katie. This decision was actually beneficial to both of them. Joan could not call his family at all during that period. There are no mobile phones in the village. Not even landlines. Except in school. And even the school was closed in the summer. The next day Joan went to his first day at the university. That day was like a rebirth to Joan's imagination. Everything was considered exciting. It was interesting for him, the clothes of young men and women, the university buildings and the laboratories with everything inside them, but he used to repeat, "This is the first step and I must succeed in it." He was serious about everything. He did not have time to merry-make with young men and women, even they called him the insane boy, as he was permanent in studying even in spare time, and was not good at merrymaking at all. He was always walking fast in the university yards, eating little, always reading and writing. He used to spend most of his time in the library reading and writing even after the end of the school day. So if he came back to the room, he did not do any studying. He just helped Mrs. Meckel a little and then slept. He was already arriving in the evening time. He was not staying up late like other young men at the university. Before going to university, on his first day, John asked Mrs. Meckel to call his high school teacher Mick. And she was told that they would call Katie and his mother after school and his college day to call them and check on. John took out a small notebook he was carrying in his pocket with the contact number and went to the university. And actually Mrs. Meckel called Mick and it was agreed as Joan said. And in the evening Joan called them. He spoke to his mother and she was crying and he said to her, "Everything is good for him. He lives with Mrs. Meckel and cares more about him. The university is good. And everything is going smoothly and without any problems." And then his mother asked to speak to Mrs. Meckel and she said to her, "Please take care of Joan. He is a good boy." And she replied to her, "He is indeed my son. And I will take care of him as if he is my son." And then Katie asked with great longing to talk to Joan and talked to him a little and her longing to him was clear. His mother felt that she needed some privacy. So she asked Mr. Mick to leave her alone for a little while. So they left her and immediately asked him how the young women in the university look like. "Did you fall in love with someone? Tell me the truth, Joan. Do not lie to me." "My love, Katie, I did not come to the university to look for love. I have one goal, which is to succeed and live with you for the rest of my life. Do not be afraid." Joan ended his conversation with everyone and hung up the line. Joy was evident on Joan from this contact. And he left Mrs. Meckel and went to his room. Mrs. Meckel started to think sadly, and saying to herself, "Wake up, Meckel. This is not your son. He has a family that cares about him and he loves them. Put limits to your love." But she told herself that I will remain to love him as if he is my son till he leaves me. Yes, he is my temporary son, Joan. And she left for her room crying and repeating more often, "He is my temporary son, Joan." Joan, from time to time, would repeat these contacts to his village in the countryside. John was not weak, but he was strong and courageous. It happened one day that he was reading in the courtyard of the university. And a group of young men and girls from the same study stage in which they were studying passed by next to him. One of the young women said, "Look at this young man that he is with us since the beginning of the year. And hardly anyone knows him. The young men are mentally unstable." And the rest began to laugh. And Joan did not show them his attention until another young man approached him. And told him, "Oh psychopath. Do you not hear what we say to you? Move, say something, stupid." Then John stood and wrapped his hand behind his back. And the rest tried to attack, and he threatened them to break his hand if they got closer. And they did not approach. And he began tightening it until his face reddened. And his body began to sweat and said to him, "Let go off my hand." And he said, "I will not let go off your hand till you weep. If you pour tears of your eyes, I will let go of your hand." And began tightening it more till he wept. Then he pushed him on the ground and said, "I can break it. But I will not break the hand of a stupid and a psychopath. You must know now who is the idiot, mentally ill." And he turned to all the young men and said, "If anyone said anything about me after that day, I would break his hand." I meant that I would break his hand. Fear began on all of their faces. And then Joan left them, and indeed no one dared to speak to Joan after that day. And the story of Joan's strength spread among them. Even most of them avoided him. And on the contrary, his admiration began to spread among the young women of the university. But John did not pay them attention, and lose his usual university lifestyle to study and return to Mrs. Meckel, sleep and so on. Joan went back to Mrs. Meckel, and some concern was clear on him. And she asked him about his condition, and he told her what happened between him and the young men. So she got angry, and advised him to stay away from them, in great fear of her for him. So he turned to her and said firmly, "Mrs. Meckel, I am really a good young man and have principles. But I am not so weak as you think. I can take my right and defend myself." Mrs. Meckel was astonished by him and said, "I did not know that you are so strong. Your response and your gaze foretells that." Joan started laughing and completed the rest of the work in the restaurant. And Joan went to sleep in his room. The first semester ended and John succeeded. And the vacation was very short. And Joan did not have enough money to travel to the village. So he decided to stay with Mrs. Meckel. And during this period their relationship with each other intensified. Because there was enough time without university. So they talked for hours. And she took him with her around the cities of games, restaurants and compounds. Joan had begun to adapt to the general atmosphere in the city, and loved the busy life and was already enjoying these tours. In return, Mrs. Meckel was enjoying going out with him to satisfy her instincts of being a mother. The study began again and there were no even incidents different from the first half. John continued diligence and hard work. And the second semester ended with Jones excelling in all subjects as usual. And the promising day came to return to his village and spend the summer with his family, Katie and all his friends. And indeed the longing had reached its end with him, and John returned to them. His mother received him eagerly, as did his father and all his brothers. But he noticed on them the effects of deep thinking and great sadness. So he asked them what happened. Did something happen to anyone? Then his father left the house in a state of great anger. John was afraid and held his mother's hand confusedly. "My mother, what happened? Please, tell me." She said, "Do you know the well? The one which irrigates the livestock of our village and the 2 villages next to us?" He said, "Yes, I know it." She said that the water in it has almost run out and is no longer sufficient for all the livestock. It is a calamity to all. We do not know what to do, we cannot live without the livestock. Water will finish soon and the season of rain will not be near. And we do not know whether there will be rain this season or not. We and all the people will have to move from this place. He told her to where. She said, "We do not know. Without water we will not be able to live," she said. Then he said, "And what the owners of the village decided?" She said, "The members of the 3 villages will meet tonight and they will search for solutions to the problem." John went out of the house and went to Katie. And the longing had taken them every way. But it did not last long when she said to him, "Have you heard about the water problem in the village?" And he answered, "Yes, I will come with them tonight to see what they will decide." And then he asked permission to sleep and be able to attend the meeting. In the evening, everyone met and everyone tried to solve the problem. Until the idea of moving from the place seemed the only solution, until one of them stood up and said to them, "There is a solution to this problem. We will not move from this place and water will be available for everyone. All of them repeated, speak and say what you have. Then he said, we should buy a large tanker to transport water from the well, the large lake which is about 50 kilometers away, and install large tanks in every village to water the animals and residents. Everyone was silent for a while and then started talking one by one. Yes, this is the best solution to the problem. He replied to them quickly, saying, time is running out, water will finish. We must move quickly. The price of this tanker will be in the range of $100,000. It should be divided between us and one of us must go to the city. One of us who knows the city well and does the purchase. Then everyone turned to John and agreed that he was the only person suitable for that task. He is studying in the city and an educated person. He will be the best without a competitor. John said, I have not completed a day since my arrival. Give me a few days. And his father said to him, Joan, we do not have time. You will go as soon as possible. And actually, members of the villages collected the amount. And Joan got ready to go after only 2 days of this meeting. And Joan said farewell to the one he loves and returned to the city. John was not happy with this mission. He and Katie. But he said to her, it will not be long and the summer vacation is still in its start. He will finish the purchase process. And will return as soon as possible. And Joan left with $100,000 in cash in his possession. And Joan put it in his bag, and put his clothes on it so that no one would pay attention to it. The morals. Goals are piecemeal steps. Do not think too much. Write steps and move from step to step. And you will approach until you reach your goal. Don't be distracted by trivia and people from achieving your goal. Knowledge is power. It will turn to the most cited in the time of difficulties. But in the time of prosperity, everyone is the same. Stay tuned for Joan's first bloody meeting with the two biggest gangs at the time. He entered the city and how he was the only winner in the biggest armed fight among them.